Hello, everyone. My name is Giovanni Nogales, and I'm a paralegal here at Laos Parker. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Texas Association for Home Care and Hospice. Today's webinar is entitled ADRs, Prepayment Reviews, Post-Payment Audits, and Suspensions, the Impact of These Administrative Enforcement Tools on Home Health and Hospice Agencies. Today's presenters are Christin Thompson and Meaghan DeBenedetto. So Christin Thompson is a senior associate at Laos Parker. Before joining Laos Parker, she worked as a professional coder assigning diagnosis and procedural codes for urgent care, inpatient, and outpatient facilities. She has experience identifying documentation deficiencies and auditing claims for a variety of practice types. Christin's provides nationwide with developing and implementing policies to improve documentation and coding practices. As for Meaghan, she's also a senior associate at Laos Parker and is a certified professional coder. She has also had experience working for a home health care agency before attending law school. Meaghan has experience with auditing claims, identifying deficiencies, and assisting clients in improving their documentations. Meaghan also has extensive experience working on compliance plans and developing policies and procedures for a variety of different medical providers. This is just a quick reminder. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will address as many as possible at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I present to you your speakers, Christin Thompson and Meaghan DeBenedetto.
Thanks, Gia. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is just a quick disclaimer. This presentation is given for informational purposes only. The situation that you're facing may vary based on your individual facts and circumstances. And we would advise you to please reach out to counsel to discuss any specific issues that you might be facing. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So first, we're going to discuss TPE audits. TPE audits were paused during COVID, but they have fully been resumed. On the slide, you can find some background on the history of TPE audits. They began in 2014, and they've sort of been evolving since that time. TPEs can be either prepayment or post-payment, so either before you've actually received payment for those claims, or it can be done after you receive payment. And these involve MACs focusing on specific providers and suppliers that bill a particular item or service. So the MACs will have something that they're targeting and then go in and review a number of claims that are involved with that one type of service or provider that they are targeting. You can go on to the next slide. It's your MAC's job to review treatment documentation and cut down on improper payments. The MACs run the TPE program. TPEs are the Targeted Probe and Educate process. And the MACs select providers based on a number of different indicators. They could be based on your billing patterns, improper payment rates, etc. There are many different reasons one could be selected for this process, and once you are selected, the typical process of how this would proceed is that you would be would have 20 to 40 claims requested. These 20 to 40 claims would either be per provider or per item or service, and then those claims would be audited, and you would receive corresponding education for any denials that you receive. There are some circumstances where more or less claims might be selected, but the 20 to 40 claims is pretty much the standard process. The TPE process is 3 different rounds, and you will be discontinued from the process whenever you're deemed compliant. So it doesn't mean that when you start that you'll actually go through 3 rounds, and ideally you will only go through 1 or 2 rounds. Each MAC sets their own standard to determine what identifies the provider as being compliant, so there's not a set denial rate. And some of these will be stated publicly on their website, or they might tell you if you ask, or it can be included in the letter you receive after you receive your audit results. If you go through the third round and are still not determined or still determined to not be compliant, then you can be referred to CMS at their discretion for further action. And those actions can have a wide range of consequences, from suspension to revocation, or to further auditing from your UPIC. So it's very important that you get through and you pass these audits and that you don't pass on to later rounds. You can go on to the next slide. When MACs are selecting who to audit, they typically are looking for outliers. This is commonly done by data mining. They'll look for things such as high volume of services, high cost, dramatic use, big change year over year. This could be up or down, or really any change that makes you different from other providers in your area. So if you provided a bunch of services, for instance, in this case, if you had a very high number of PT services, that could cause a TP audit, or if you suddenly stop providing services that you previously had provided, that could cause an audit. It's really anything that the data mining shows makes you different from your peers or from yourself in previous years. Those could just get the interest of the MAC. Now, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing anything wrong, but it just might mean that they want to look into and see why your processes have changed. Providers can also be referred to MACs to go through the TPE process. These referrals could come from any of the contractors. They could be RACs, UPICs, or the OIG, for example. MACs tend to target providers that have had historically high claim denial rates, have billing practices that vary from their peers, or when there is evidence that there's a potential risk to Medicare trust fund. When you receive audits, it could be a UPIC, it could be a RAC, it could be a single ADR, which will be discussed later, and you answer those, it's very important that you follow through on those processes and get your claims approved and make sure that you're following the rules, because as noted, if you continue to have high denial rates or lose a number of claims, that can push you further into auditing processes such as triggering a TPE audit. And if you've ever been through the TPE process, or if you ever go through it, you'll realize that this is quite an extensive process that really it takes a large amount of time and effort to get through, and can be very stressful. So you want to try to avoid this as much as possible. Now, in some states, the TPE process is almost impossible to avoid, in which case then you just have to, do your best and get through it. But you don't want to trigger additional audits wherever necessary. Plus, you don't want to have denials and have to refund money for services that you have rendered. All right, you can go on to the next slide. If you're selected for the TPE process, you'll receive a letter. This will state that you have been selected for review. The letter explains the TPE process. It'll say what you can expect, and also discusses the one-on-one education you're entitled to as part of this process. The letter will also discuss how the MAC has the option to refer providers to the RAC or the UPIC if the provider fails to respond to the ADRs that you receive. You definitely want to make sure that you are responding to all requests received, and that you're not missing any deadlines, because that can just result in unnecessary denials. You will receive ADRs for the 20 to 40 claims that are selected for the TPE process. These ADRs are additional document requests, and Christin will be talking about that process further as well. And each claim that's selected as part of the TPE, though, receives an ADR. These are separate letters that will be received until the identified number of claims have been sampled. So you might receive one letter one week, 5 letters the next week, and you might just keep receiving these requests until you receive typically 20 to 40. For the first round of the TPE process, claims are selected based on the date of your claim submission. So as most of the time, you have up to a year to file claims, sometimes more, sometimes less. They will be selecting them anytime based on when you submitted them. So it could take a pretty large range of when the services were actually rendered. After that, though, in the 2 subsequent rounds, the claims are selected based on your dates of service. This is because they want to ensure you've had time to implement the education that they provided throughout this process. This is so, if they told you how to update your documentation, and you rendered services 6 months ago, and you just happen to bill those claims, it maybe is you haven't implemented all of the education that they provided. So they don't want to review those claims. They want to make sure that they're new claims, and that you've really had a chance to implement the education. There's also specific notification language that has to be included. This is included on the slide as well. Specifically, though, the second bullet point, which is critical because it discusses that CMS has the authority to revoke a provider's Medicare billing privileges if CMS determines that the provider has a pattern or practice of submitting claims that fail to meet Medicare requirements. This means that if you have a high error rate, they can revoke you. We can't really go into all the specifics of the revocation process today. That would require and is its own webinar. So just to know that revocations and suspensions are potential risks, though, that you can face depending on how you do during the TPE process. The things that typically could result in revocation are repetitive errors, which is another reason why, though, it's so important to keep up with your compliance practices and have a robust compliance plan being enforced to ensure that all denials are addressed. You don't want to just be like, oh, that's a low overpayment, I'm just going to refund it and not deal with it. If you believe that the claims are correct, it is very important that you pursue the appeal process. The appeal process also just tells the government that you do believe in your claims. If you just accept the denials and don't appeal them, it suggests an inference that there might be something else wrong, or you believe that also that you're doing them wrong. So therefore, we really recommend that you appeal all claims that have any reasonable basis for appeal. You can go on to the next slide. When you receive a records request, you should gather the requested records just like you would for any other audit. It's very important that you go through and you check your documentation for completeness and accuracy. You should ensure that all required documents are included based on the types of claims requested. The types of documents to be submitted can vary, but some MACs have listed helpful guides on their website. You should also carefully review the letter received because it sometimes includes additional information that may be requested that you wouldn't expect to be required. This could be something like documentation from an earlier episode of care or anything else that could support the current episode. So it's very important that you take a chance to go to your MAC's website and you read over any information or guidance that they might provide to make sure that you're collecting and presenting the documentation that should be there. It's also very important that you comply with the stated deadlines. Each claim could have a different due date based on the letter that you received. So for the 20 to 40 claims, you could have 20 to 40 deadlines. Therefore, it's very important that you track these. It's recommended that you might create a spreadsheet or have some other sort of chart that tracks deadlines and what's been submitted to ensure that no deadlines are missed. Failure to submit records is one of the most common denials and can result in a referral for either a UPIC audit, which could be an extrapolated audit, or could result in massive overpayments being assessed. And also, it's just a waste of one of the steps of this TPE process. So if you receive the letters, you don't submit your documents, you get all denials, and then you move on to round 2, well, then your documents haven't been reviewed, so you don't know what actual issues you have. So the only education that can be provided pretty much is submit your records. And then you might move on to the second round and where they review your records and then they actually tell you what is wrong with your records. And then you only have one more round in order to implement those changes versus getting the 2 full rounds of education and opportunity to reflect on that education and improve your documentation to try to pass this process. So it's very important that you not miss any deadlines and that you track these and you really fully comply and proceed with the appeals process. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. When you submit your documentation, the MAC does a medical review to identify any concerns. When the MAC identifies an easily curable error, the MAC should contact you to allow you a chance to address the error and submit missing documentation, et cetera, whatever these easily cured errors are. However, I will say that that doesn't always occur, and you might just receive a bunch of denials for things that should be pretty easy to fix, like a signature or a missing document. Now, I'll say though, for many healthcare providers, a signature is an easily fixed issue. You can normally do a signature attestation for an unsigned note that can be cured, but it's a little bit different for home health and hospice because not all missing signatures can be cured. For example, an unsigned 485 cannot be cured by an attestation, as that must be signed prior to billing as a condition of payment. So while some signature issues can be cured, a missing or an unsigned note from a nurse could be cured with a signature attestation. You just need to be careful that you understand which signatures are curable and which ones aren't, because if you're into the TPE process and your 485s were not signed and you billed out for these claims, it's not going to be possible to really win those claims on appeal as you failed to follow the conditions of payment. If a provider failed to submit some notes, those issues can be easily cured with a supplement if you're given the opportunity. If you're going through the TPE process and you realize you've forgotten documents, you should submit them then. If the documents are received before the results are granted, they are supposed to review those, so you can add in and bolster your documentation before a decision is issued. If they are not requested before, though, you can include them in your appeal, which could hopefully address those denials that you might receive. If you keep in mind, though, that the appeals do not necessarily help you in the TPE process, though, as the appeals do not have to be considered as reducing your error rate, even if you win those appeals. This makes sense, though, because throughout the appeal process, it can take months to resolve all of those appeals. And often you will have already moved on to the next round before you get a chance to resolve and finalize the appeals. If the appeals are processed quickly enough or the rounds are delayed, it is possible that the appeals can reduce your denial rate, but that is up to the MAC and it's not a guarantee. We do know of at least one MAC who has put the second round on hold and would not proceed with the auditing process until the results of the appeal were received, and had other MACs that have been willing to discuss it and review the individual circumstances. But this is not the normal circumstances, and it's definitely not something that you should rely on, as it's up to the MAC to decide whether or not to pursue into the second round. Of course, it would be to your benefit if they do hold your auditing process before moving you to the second round, because it allows you a chance to hopefully win those claims on appeal, especially if there's some easy denials that were easily addressed and you've been able to support, which could hopefully then reduce your error rate and maybe remove you from the TPE process. This is, though, just something to be aware of, but it's not a guarantee. TPEs are typically returned in 30 days for prepayment claims and 60 days for post-payment reviews. These are just averages, though, and can vary widely based on the actual review process. The TPE reviews are supposed to be conducted by qualified individuals, such as registered nurses, certified coders, or other people that are appropriate and relevant to your industry. But that's not always the case. I recently worked on a dental audit that was conducted by nurses that had never had any experience with working on dental claims. So they were not dental nurses. They really had no idea about anything that they were working on. So it's not always the case that they have experience in your industry. And even if they do, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have results that will make sense. We have seen many denials that are just kind of out there or based on things that aren't rules or enforcing documentation requirements that don't exist. But those are things that you can push back on through the appeal process and explain what the requirements are, and also can be discussed with the MAC during the TPE probe and educate process. And it's possible that you might have to update your practices to reflect the education they provide, even if you disagree with their denials. just to ensure that you pass and continue on and out of the TPE process. You'll often find that the reviews are kind of like a bean counting experience. They'll have a checklist and they're just checking off each item to see if it's there and if it meets the requirements. These reviews are not based on, common sense or arguments that good care was provided or that beneficiaries were had their quality of life improved by the services. That's not what the point of these audits are. It's very much to check to see if you met and exceeded each requirement. So you could have done the most thorough wound care for a patient that they clearly needed, that they were suffering from really bad possible outcomes, and you could have done the best possible care. But if you did not, have the 485 sign in time, you're still going to have those claims denied. So it's very important to realize that this is not just common sense or what you think, oh, well, I definitely rendered good care. That's not the point. It's to make sure that you're meeting the documentation requirements. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So this describes really a timeline of the TPE process. We've already gone over a lot of this, but we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail. How the TPE process works: you first get a letter saying that you're selected, then you get told of the 20 to 40 claims that will be reviewed. You go through the medical review process. If those claims are denied, you get invited to a one-on-one education session. It's very important that you attend the provided education. Some providers decline this, thinking that they know the rules or that they won't benefit from the education. But it's very important that you do attend and take advantage of the education and really understand why your claims are being denied. You're allowed and should ask questions. You're meeting directly with the reviewers who will be overseeing your audit throughout this process. So this is really your best chance to get to understand how the MAC interprets the rules. There can be some disagreement about what requirements mean. So hearing what the MAC believes that the rule states, it tells you what you need to do. And again, regardless of if the MAC is right or wrong of what the requirements are, the quickest way to get claims approved is to abide by their interpretation and what they'll enforce. So you can mention, the inconsistencies or how they're wrong in your appeals and deal with those claims that are already denied. But as far as moving forward, you typically want to incorporate what they've told you to make sure that you're passing and doing what they're expecting, so that way you get through this appeal process and don't get put on for either other audits or further action. After education, you're given at least 45 days to make changes and improvements. This can be extended. We've had clients who've had up to a year between TPE rounds. Oftentimes they've thought that they might have been forgotten, but they weren't, and it did circle back around, and then they did get their second round. So you can't count on having extra time either. You really need to work swiftly. When you receive your education session, you can incorporate the findings and what you've been educated on to improve your documentation. You update your practices to ensure that you pass later rounds. After the waiting period, 20 to 40 new claims will be selected and go through the whole process again. At the end of that, you will get an education session again if any of those claims are denied. And then you have at least 45 days to implement the changes again before moving into round 3. This is, of course, if you're continuing to be deemed non-compliant. At any point, though, you could be determined to be compliant and removed from the process. If after round 3 you're found to be compliant, not compliant, then you could be referred out to CMS for other action. If you're found to be compliant, you will not be reviewed again for at least 1 year on the selected topic that was reviewed in this TPE process. You can have multiple TPEs, though, covering different types of claims, different providers, different locations at the same time. So it doesn't mean that you go through one TPE and you're just done. You can still also be audited by a UPIC or a RAC or other contractor. This doesn't prevent anyone else from auditing you. It just means that the narrow issue that was specifically covered by the TPE wouldn't be reviewed again for 1 year, with the caveat, though, that if your billing practices significantly change, they might come back and audit you again, even for the same specific issue, even within that 1 year time frame. Now, typically what I mean by if your billing practices change, it would be if you were billing a certain way you got audited and educated, and your billing changed to reflect the education. And then as soon as the TPE process was completed, as soon as you were removed, then your billing just reverted exactly back to what it was before. That might trigger their interest and come back to look to see why did you go exactly back to what you'd been doing before that they'd educated you on was wrong. And they're obviously, as you'd expect, a lot harsher if they come back and review you again, and much more likely to refer you to other audits or action if you have just gone through, you received the education, you made the changes, then you reverse it. So that is definitely something that you don't want to have happen. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. This is a flow chart that also depicts some of the information that we've already been discussing. It shows how you make it through the rounds and how you get out of the TPE process, or when you go on for possible further action. You really don't want to get on to round 3. If you fail round 1, this happens. It's pretty normal. It's not nothing to beat yourself up about. You get education, and then hopefully you modify your practices. And your goal then needs to be to put everything into passing round 2. You really don't want to fail round 2 and move on to round 3, because the risks associated with failing round 3 are potentially devastating. You could be sent on to any number of further actions, such as a UPIC audit, which could include an extrapolated audit, which can have massive overpayments. You could have a suspension or even a revocation from CMS because of these patterns of practices. They can shut your agency down based on these suspensions. Many providers can't survive those, and Christin will talk more about suspensions later. But these are just some of the highest risk areas that providers can face, and why you really don't want to make it onto round 3. Therefore, you really want to engage with this process, especially the education, to avoid failing round 3 and facing further action. If you do move into round 3, do not freak out though. Ensure that you fully take advantage of the education and you make all appropriate changes to make sure you pass that final round before it concludes, though, to keep you from facing any of the worst possible consequences. All right, you can go on to the next chart. Okay, so this is the most common denial throughout the TPE process on the screen, especially for home health and hospice agencies, like what we have found from the claims we've worked on. The number one denial reason we've seen is for missing or inadequate face-to-face documentation. The face-to-face requirements have been in place for really a long time at this point. It has changed a couple of times throughout the years, but it's been pretty steady now, and agencies are required to be collecting the actual notes from the nurse or from the provider who's referring the patients for services. But yet this still remains a major issue for agencies. Many agencies do not collect the actual notes, and they might collect them then in response to the audit. And of course, you can collect them at that time, but you are required to have already had them. But of course, if you don't have notes, you want to collect them then. But the problem that you often find is when you collect the notes later, also oftentimes they don't meet the actual requirements. It's required that the actual notes of the encounter document, for instance, the primary reason the services are needed. So if the patient was seen at the doctor, your primary diagnosis should also need to be reflected on that encounter note from the doctor. It doesn't have to be the only thing discussed at the doctor's visit, but it needs to be documented as an issue that was addressed. Another common issue that we find with face-to-face is not being performed by the certifying physician. There are some exceptions when it can be provided by someone else, such as acute care or through a mid-level working under supervision. But these arrangements need to be documented. The certifying physician still must review the face-to-face encounter notes, including if it's from an acute care facility, and they should have a copy of those notes in their record. Oftentimes it's recommended that those notes be signed by the physician, stating that they reviewed them, even though it's not their service. Another issue is failing to document the date the face-to-face occurred and the physician certification. These certifications can be put in several different places. Some have incorporated it into their encounter notes. Some have incorporated into the 485. That's been the more common answer recently is to have a box in the 485. It's recommended that the date of the face-to-face encounter be incorporated in the 485 to ensure that the requirement is met. But oftentimes, even when providers have started to include this box in their 485, we found that it's often left blank, which is resulting in many denials. You should be conducting regular internal audits and reviews of your face-to-face and certification documents. You should be doing regular audits and reviews anyway, but especially of this documentation, because this is coming from, potentially dozens and dozens of different doctors outside of your organization. They all might have different documenting practices, and you need to make sure that every single document coming in is being reviewed to make sure these face-to-face requirements are being met. If something is wrongly documented, it is not the physician who will be held responsible. It's the agency who won't get paid for these services, or worse, have been paid and then have those monies recouped. So it's very important that you're reviewing all of these documents to make sure that the face-to-face documentation requirements are met. These documents are very high risk and are really the basis of many of the denials we see. And most of these denials cannot be rectified after the services have been billed. So it needs to be done before you bill for the services that were rendered. Also mentioned on here, records not being submitted is a common denial. That, as we've already discussed, it's very important that you're making sure that all documents are being turned in. The medical necessity is another big denial reason that we have seen, and that's typically issues for home health and hospice. What they find is that they don't, or they use more standardized language. So in your visit note, the nurse might document the services, or the PT, SDOT to document the services, and they use just very canned language, and that language might be copied and pasted from multiple different patients, and not really show anything specific about that patient or why these particular services were necessary, or really demonstrating that these services were performed. The last thing you want is to have the same narrative included in each note. So those should be getting regularly reviewed, make sure that nurses are reflecting individual facts, and all other providers are reflecting individual facts about the patients that they're treating in their notes. And these are just a brief overview. All of these issues could have their own webinar to really dig into how to update them, but you need to be making sure that you're going through all of the notes throughout the process, and not just through the TP process, but just as in general part of your compliance process, to make sure that you're updating as necessary and educating your providers. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. After you complete each round, you get offered one-on-one education with the auditor. This can be completed via phone call. It might be a webinar. Very rarely it is done in person. It should be noted that if you call the MAC after you receive your results, though, sometimes they'll have this informal discussion with you, and then they consider that informal discussion to be education. So make sure you're clear that the discussion you're having is not considered your education until you're fully prepared to discuss all of the issues. You want to make sure that you have fully read the results and have a list of questions and have all the people you want to be present there and able to engage in the education. We've had many clients tell us that they've called the auditor and just had a quick, 1 or 2 questions that they were asking, and then the auditor stated that they'd already received their education. So you need to be careful about this and push back if it occurs, and make sure that you're really engaging in the education process and getting everything that you need out of it. These calls are genuinely for your education. So if the reviewer is going too quickly, or if they're using language you're unfamiliar with, or they cite a rule that you're not familiar with, you can ask them to repeat themselves, explain themselves, slow down, tell you where the information is located. They can give you the regulation or the guidance. That's the basis of the denials. You really just want to engage with this and make sure that you understand every part of the denials, so that way you can make the necessary changes and not fail future audits. You can go on to the next slide. The education you receive should be individualized, it should be claim specific, and it should be conducted in a format that is interactive. So as the provider, you should be able to engage and ask questions of the reviewer. You should be able to have anyone you want on the call with you. So you'll want to have critical members of your organization who are in charge of compliance participate and make sure that all of their questions are addressed. That could also include your biller. It could include your legal representative. Anyone who is involved in the CPE process and making sure you're going to pass is probably who you want to have involved, just to make sure that they are engaging and everyone is understanding what needs to be done in order for you to pass the next round. If you're denied for a reason that you're not familiar with, as I mentioned, make sure that you're asking questions about it. Make sure you're understanding it. You're asking for the regulation so you can review it. Just really dig in to make sure you understand. Ask questions about any claims that were reviewed in the audit. You can ask about specific claims, so you can use the actual details to ensure you understand what they're saying and why the claims are denied to fix the next round. So you don't have to just speak in generalities. You can speak about the actual claims, because the reviewers should be familiar with your case and your claims when you get on the phone with them. And if they're not, they're able to go back and look into that and answer some of your questions. You can go on to the next slide. You'll then receive a results letter. This will say why the claims are denied, including the specific errors you'll be given. Or calculate your error rate at that time as well. You'll also include details on how to appeal any denied claim. There are strict deadlines associated with appealing the denials to be complied with. The deadlines for recoupment are often earlier, well, not, but they are earlier than the deadline to appeal the denials. So be sure to carefully review all letters, including the demand letters you receive, to document the different types of deadlines to make sure that you're not being recouped when you're not expecting it, or things like that, and make sure you're avoiding all surprises there and complying with all of the deadlines. We recommend that you appeal any denials that you believe were wrongly decided or have any basis to support the claim, and make sure that you're appealing these throughout the appeals process to try to get paid for the services that you rendered. You can go on to the next slide. You can be referred to CMS at the MAC's discretion after 3 rounds of the TPE. However, you can also be referred to the UPIC at any time. They do not have to wait for you to complete the 3 rounds. So if something is very concerning to the MAC, or they suspect fraud for whatever reason, you may be referred to the UPIC, who might then choose to conduct an audit of their own. This could be a statistically valid random sample, which would then be an extrapolated audit depending on how high your denial rate is, which could result in potential overpayments of hundreds of thousands to even millions of dollars. So these are huge audits that could be very detrimental to your agency, and it's very important that you don't get referred out. This is why we recommend hiring external assistance during this process. It's in the interest of all parties to have assistance from the beginning, as it'll help your ability to lower your denial rates and hopefully exit the process to a later round. You don't want to wait until you've failed multiple rounds, because you only have 3 chances. And also, if you do very poorly in that first round, they might just prefer you out then, and you don't have a chance to improve or go throughout the process. If you refuse education that is offered, that's noted when you're referred out. So that refusal may result in negative inferences about your agency. The reviewers might believe that you are not fully engaged in compliance, or make other negative inferences about you. And so you definitely do not want to just refuse the education, regardless of how helpful you think it may or may not be. You can go on to the next slide. If you have a sufficiently low error rate, you can be removed from the TPE process after any of the rounds. After the TPE process, the MACs continue to use data analysis to monitor your billing practices. If the billing practices change or revert back to what they were before the audit, that'll be noted and can result in resumption of the TPEs or further action, such as referral to CMS. Your error rate it can be calculated a number of different ways. Each MAC has their own rules for how it's calculated. It can be based on the dollars denied versus dollars that would have been reimbursed if the claim was paid. It could be based on the specific number of claims denied out of the whole. or some mix of these processes. Your MAC will choose how they calculate your denial rate. This should be documented in the letters you receive. They also determine what the acceptable denial rate will be to get out of the TPE process. So keep in mind that the denials can vary based on your jurisdiction for the number of claims you can have denied. Some MACs have posted this information publicly, some haven't. It should be included in your letter, but if it's not, sometimes they'll tell you when you call. Otherwise, you might just keep getting pushed through the process and not know when or what you need to achieve. Can you go on to the next slide? This is some examples of what has been said in the past of what their error rate thresholds are. These could have changed, but they were collected during previous cases we've worked on. For example, Palmetto stated if you have less than a 20% error rate, you'd be removed from the TP process. So if you hit anything over that, if you hit 20.1%, you would be moved on to round 2. But if you were at 19.9, you could be removed from the process and not have to continue. So these error rates, though, might change. Their guidance might change. It could change based on the number of audits they're doing or how backed up they are. It's just something to be aware of, that there is a number that you're trying to aim for, but of course, you're always trying to have every claim appealed, or every claim approved. So, it's not just the goal of hitting the bare minimum. You're trying to have your claims approved and paid. You go on to the next slide. These are some compliance tips. You should check out your MAC's TPE website. You can review topics, dates, documentation checklists, and education information that might be available on there. It's very important that you make sure your point of contact is correct and up to date in PICOs. They'll use this to contact you. So if you have the wrong information in there, it could result in you missing vital communications. We've seen in the past providers forgetting to update the email address, and they have someone who was formerly at the practice receiving the emails, and you could miss very important information, as sometimes these are communicated just via email. So you also want to be checking your spam folders and closely monitoring your email to make sure that nothing important is missed in your mailboxes, because these are often letters sent not certified, and so it can be hard to know if something is there if you're not carefully checking all of your emails and all of your mail. You should conduct internal reviews of records before submitting them. You should check to make sure no additional documentation is necessary, and then check that your documentation is complete and accurate before it's being submitted. You need to make sure you're responding within the notice letter's time frame. You should track your ADRs via spreadsheet or some other process to make sure that you're not missing any deadlines. As noted, you could have many different deadlines going on at the same time, especially if you have appeals and you're moving into round 2. You could have 2 different TPE processes going concurrently with the appeals. You could also receive multiple different types of TPEs based on the number of types of services you have or providers. So you could have a lot of claims being audited at one time, which could get very confusing, could have a lot of deadlines associated with it. So you want to have some process in place to make sure you're tracking and responding to these. You, again, do not refuse the education offered. Make sure that everyone who needs it receives the education and makes the necessary changes. You need to make sure you gather all of your staff to make sure the updates are timely communicated because of the tight timelines, and make sure that these documentation requirements are being complied with. You should identify any changes to your policies, procedures, or documentation that are needed based on the education and denials, and then implement those very quickly to prepare for the next round of TPE. And that's true even if you pass the TPE audit and you don't move on to the next round. The education you receive for denied claims, you're still going to want to understand and incorporate and make sure that you're not having other issues, because you could be audited again, and you want to make sure that those claims are not going to become a bigger issue in the future. You go on to the next slide. ADRs are a part of the TPE process, as we've been discussing them, because you receive additional document requests for the 20 to 40 records. However, they're also a separate audit process that can occur at the same time or completely separate from the TPEs. A single ADR is less risk because it's just one claim. It's not part of an audit system. However, ADRs can result in referral for further auditing, so they could still be taken, should still be taken very seriously. TPEs are more claims and therefore a higher risk. And as a reminder, you can be in multiple TPE probes at the same time. You can receive multiple ADRs at the same time. You can receive both at any time. So the fact that you're under a TPE doesn't mean you might not receive other ADRs. The fact that you responded to ADRs doesn't mean you won't receive a TPE. Different types of audits can occur at the same time or subsequent to each other, and are really just completely separate processes. And Christin's now going to take over to further discuss the ADRs and some of the other auditing processes.
Thanks, Megan. So next slide. There we go. Additional document requests are part of Medicare's overall medical review program. Authority to request additional documentation can be found in various sections of the Social Security Act, like sections 1883E and 1814A. The most important thing to understand is that a MAC has the authority to review any claims at any time. As a Medicare participating provider, the cost of doing business is that you're going to get audited. It's not a matter of if you're going to avoid it, it's a matter of when and whether you're ready when the time comes. Next slide. ADRs are done prior to payment of a claim and are usually handled by the MAC. Some can come from other contractors, it's just not as common. There are various reasons that providers receive ADRs. An element of a claim might need a prepayment edit. It could be a national edit. There could be a specific national review program focusing on specific ICD-10 or CPT codes. We are seeing a lot of these particular programs right now. It could also be a provider-specific edit based on reasons or edits developed by the MAC's internal medical review or program integrity unit. All prepayment edits can key in on a beneficiary's number, the provider's NPI, service date, CPT, HICS, PICS, or ICD-10 codes, or a variety of other reasons and data points. Next slide. MACs must be able to review a claim in an apples-to-apples manner. For example, the standards of one procedure, diagnosis, or place of service type cannot be used to determine the appropriateness of another procedure, diagnosis, or place of service type. This is particularly tricky for the MACs reviewers, we've seen, when they're assessing a family of codes. And special attention should be paid to the similarities and differences for distinguishing codes within families. I am seeing frequently in some of my reviews where they are applying higher level standards to lower level codes within the same family. We can point it out that you are meeting the documentation standards, that they're applying the requirements improperly, and help to clarify for them what standards are actually applied to each level of code. Next slide. For ADRs, you're going to receive a letter sent to the address on file in PICOs. You need to make sure that this address is current, just like Megan said. An ADR has a 30-day response deadline. So if your address isn't current, then you can run into issues where you're not able to file things in a timely manner. One MAC states documentation received after the 30-day deadline may not be completed within their own 45-day review window. So that's going to delay you getting a response from them. And if the provider fails to respond by day 40, the claim is automatically denied. The timeline is critical for ADRs. One of the major denial reasons related to them is that the documentation just isn't received. It's hard to believe that a provider wouldn't respond to an ADR when they get one. It could just be that the quick timelines are the problem, along with gathering the requested records and submitting them. It is really important to be aware of those deadlines, like Megan was discussing with the TPEs, and to make sure you're getting the documents submitted in time. You can always supplement, which is important as long as you make sure that you put your ADR cover letter on those supplements and make sure it's fairly clear to the contractor that you're submitting these as supplements and not as initial submissions. Next slide. This is a quick visual of submitting the ADR. you're going to send each ADR packet separately, which is fine when it's just one or two, but can be really cumbersome when it's a dozen or more. The ADR cover letter should always be included and put on the top of your record. It can be helpful to submit the documentation through the electronic portal. It will get there instantly. The processing times are faster, you get the results faster, and then you get paid faster to the extent your claim is determined to be payable. I'm old-fashioned though, I send everything by mail. It's your preference on whether you use the electronic portal or mail in your response. If you're going to mail things, always get a tracking number. In either case, always keep a copy of your record. Many providers don't do that, and when a claim gets denied, they bring us on board and are unable to provide an exact copy of the files submitted to the MAC. A lot of times they'll offer to repull it from the EMR, but we can't be 100% sure that's exactly what was sent to the MAC. As a result, we don't know with certainty what the MAC is looking at, so it's really, really important to keep an exact copy of those records on file that you've submitted in response to an ADR. If the MAC overlooks something, we can say we have a copy of the record, we have the page numbers, and we can point them to that specific spot in the submitted file. The reviewer could say a record is unsigned, but we can point to the physician's signature on a specific page, for example. And that's a quick way to correct a wrong assessment on the part of the reviewer and get an easy win. Be sure to pick up the phone and call the MAC with any questions. They do have a provider education department and provider resource line. So it's always worth asking, particularly if you've identified a mistake and it's something that's easily correctable. Next slide. What is the difference between receiving an ADR and being placed on prepayment review? ADRs are typically initiated by a provider's MAC, and they typically relate to a particular probe or edit conducted by the MAC. They can also be focused on specific services, lengths of stay, a provider-specific diagnosis, or other reasons. In contrast to an ADR, being placed on prepayment review is usually going to affect 100% of your claims, and it can last for a year or more. It's an intensive process, and rarely less than 100% of your claims are going to go through the review. That's going to affect revenue stream for your agency. Next slide. For prepayment reviews, UPICs will typically send notice to the provider if they're selected for review. However, we've seen quite a number of providers who've never gotten a notice before, who've just started receiving requests for documentation, which can be alarming. There is a provision in the Medicare Program Integrity Manual that says they should provide notice, and you should push back and make sure you get that documentation if you have not received it before you start receiving requests for documentation. Private payers are increasingly placing providers on prepayment review, and unlike Medicare and other governmental payers, very few private payer contracts go into very much detail on their processes. When it comes to how the provider may be placed on prepayment review, they also typically don't address the scope of the prepayment review. So it could be very uncharted territory to get into a prepayment review with a private contractor. From a practical standpoint, the payments can be delayed up to 6 months or longer. So we want to make sure that where possible, we don't jeopardize that revenue stream. Next slide. With any audit, our advice is always the same. Never ignore the problem and review the claims and associated documentation before you send them in. There are many of the things that we pointed out before. These are many of the things that we've pointed out before. Make sure medical necessity is substantiated. Make sure the services billed are documented. Make sure the documentation complies with local coverage determinations or national coverage determinations. If they don't, if there are missing elements, go to the provider to prepare an addendum in line with the Medicare record-keeping principles. We want to make sure that we fill in those gaps whenever possible. Clearly marking these addendums, not altering the original documentation, is critical. Making sure they're signed off with the date that the addendum or correction is made is crucial to making sure that these things are accepted. If your providers are doing all of that, they are able to make the addendum to their documentation to clarify, to correct, or to elaborate. It's important to take advantage of the initial review that you're of documentation that you're doing before you submit this to the MAC, and it becomes a part of the administrative record. You also want to check whether the claims are coded, billed, and paid correctly. We think so much about documentation being the patient's narrative, but we also want to make sure that the back end affecting payment is also reviewed. Next slide. So what is a post-payment review? Post-payment audits occur after a provider has submitted a claim to receive payment. Basically, they're looking at claims that have already been paid. To the extent there are any issues determined, for example, eligibility requirements weren't met or the claim isn't supported, they would then ask for that money back through a demand letter. There are a lot of different sources for post-payment review. We're seeing data mining, and of course, contractors can basically look at the data however they want, which makes it easier for providers to get selected for that post-payment review. Some of the things they might see when they're looking at that information: are you billing more than your peers? Did you have a change in your reimbursement last year to this year? There's so many different ways they can look at it, and it's really one of the big reasons that providers get targeted for post-payment review. You can be placed in post-payment review because of complaints or referrals as well. When you get a post-payment review notice, one of the first things we do in our firm is that we file a Freedom of Information Act request. We want to know what's going on. Where did the source come from? Was it a referral? Was it a complaint? Or, was it the more common reason? Is it a data mining source? It takes a long time to get this information back, but eventually we do get it, and it can be very, very helpful in narrowing or identifying what the scope of the review is. Sometimes we get some very specific details from the contractor's investigative files. Next slide. There are several big concerns with post-payment reviews. The money has already been paid and used for overhead and salaries, and now the payer is asking to get that money back. Getting the money together when it's demanded from the provider can be very difficult. Post-payment audits are sometimes extrapolated, like Meaghan mentioned. When overpayments are extrapolated, you may be talking about a lot more than just the sample of claims that's been submitted, depending on the rate and universe of claims. We see too often several thousands of dollars quickly becoming hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are also oftentimes lots of errors identified per claim, each of which must be overcome to reverse a denial. So when you go through the appeals process, you might be able to win the face-to-face issue, but then you still have to prove the medical necessity denial. The more denials you have per claim, the harder it is to win them because you're trying to defend multiple aspects. Medicare can deny your claim for any number of reasons. In order for you to get paid, you have to win on every single reason. Next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the CMS appeals statistics. It's always important to look at these. They haven't been updated in a couple years. One of the main points is it's better to get this all sorted out in the medical review process, respond with solid documentation, and get your claim paid because going through the appeals process is long and time consuming. And also you might not win. If you look at 2012 and then at 2020, those numbers have dropped dramatically for fully favorable and partially favorable. You don't want to get into the appeals process. It's long, you have multiple levels of review, and each of those takes months to complete. Next slide. What is a suspension? Suspensions are terrible. Your revenue stops, and it's going to stop very likely for a minimum of 180 days. Sometimes suspensions are extended when the contractor hasn't completed their investigation, and that generally doubles the length of suspension to a whole year. You might be getting paid for claims, but the money's held in escrow until the investigation is completed. So even though claims are going through, you're not getting any of the funds. When your payer mixes heavily Medicare, this is a huge amount of your reimbursement and can be debilitating if you're not getting paid. Once your suspension is lifted, the funds held in escrow are applied immediately to any overpayments that are determined. So you may or may not get any remaining balance from those funds. There are several different reasons that a provider can be placed on suspension. One of the most common that we see is credible allegations of fraud. Next slide. So what is a credible allegation of fraud? Unfortunately, for providers, the barrier to establish this for CMS is extremely low. It could be based on a probe audit. They'll tell you that the medical review results for the probe audit weren't satisfactory. It could be a hotline complaint, more of the data mining. It could be from a law enforcement investigation. When you receive your suspension notice, the letter generally references 5 claims and will note the documentation didn't support that the services were medically necessary. This can be their credible allegation of fraud, and you are suspended for 180 days. They don't have to tell you anything about their actual analysis or how they applied the Medicare coverage criteria in. You could take the opportunity to respond to those 5 claims that they did identify, but again, we often see the investigation that's occurring during suspension is going to take the full 180 days in terms of knowing whether your suspension is going to be lifted. You're going to get a notice letter, but they usually send it on the day of or the day before the suspension actually occurs, so you don't really have notice. Basically, today is the 7th, they issued the letter, and on February 8th, you receive the letter and find that you were suspended on the 7th. So it's almost an immediate situation. Next slide. As I mentioned, after receiving notice of a suspension, you do have the opportunity to submit a rebuttal. We always recommend submitting one, even though it doesn't often result in a reversal of the suspension, because it's part of your defense. They're giving you some of the allegations, even though those are generic and they're only related to those 5 claims. It's your opportunity to respond to them to collect and submit additional documentation. Sometimes they say we interviewed beneficiaries who tell them they didn't receive the services. You could potentially go back and ask those beneficiaries to sign affidavits. If they agree they receive the services, you can do things to begin to develop your defense for your later appeals. When they finally release you from suspension and you go through the appeals process, you have the best documentation you can and you're ready to support those services. Next slide. Some conclusions here: the potential results of a bad audit can be increased likelihood of post-payment review, overpayments, repayments, cash flow shortages. It would lead to suspension of your Medicare payments. We know how difficult that can be. And then it also could lead to revocation, which is an entirely different administrative process that takes an entire hour to discuss. The things you can do to minimize impact on these types of audits and suspension mechanisms is to start compliance now. If your practice receives any kind of notice, prepayment, postpayment, or suspension, get legal counsel involved immediately. The sooner you do, the sooner that providers get back to business as normal. You really need someone who knows these processes and knows what it takes to go through the audits or the suspension as fast as possible. More than anything else, never ignore a notice from Medicare. It won't go away, and it's a basis for them to escalate to more severe administrative actions later. Next slide. We want to thank you for having us today, and we're happy to address any questions that may have come up. I appreciate you bearing with us. We're running a couple minutes over today. Gio, I'll give it back to you.
Hi, thank you. So it looks like we don't have any questions. Most of the questions are just asking about the CEU credits and the PowerPoint slides. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our speakers, Meaghan, DeBenedetto, and Christin Thompson. Everyone from today's webinar will receive a copy of the presentation tomorrow via email. And if you have any further question about today's discussion or another healthcare law issue, please feel free to reach out to Liz Parker or to Meaghan or Christin, as you can see above. Have a good Wednesday and take care.